Welcome everyone to Articulate Economics webinar, The Fiscal Response to COVID and its Impact. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands where I'm hosting and recording this webinar from, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all are participating in this webinar. We pay our respects to elders past and present. Hello everyone, my name is Meg, External Engagement Officer at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the University of Sydney. Before we begin, just quick housekeeping. This webinar has live transcription. So to see the transcription, please go to the tool, the Zoom toolbar at the bottom, click the little drop-down arrow next to the live transcript and hit show subtitle or view full transcript. This webinar will be recorded as well. So if you have to leave early for another class, it will be recorded and shared with you later on. And there will be a live Q&A session. Please feel free to add your questions using the Q&A tool at the bottom of the Zoom toolbar, and it will be answered towards the end of the webinar. Okay. Before introducing Associate Professor Singh, I'd also like to thank Jamie from Farrier Memorial Agricultural High School in Tamworth for reaching out to us to request this webinar. And we hope this webinar will be valuable for your class, as well as all students, teachers, and community members here today. Okay, so I would like to introduce Associate Professor Aarti Singh. Associate Professor Aarti Singh teaches in the School of Economics at the University of Sydney. She has taught macroeconomics at all levels from introductory to advanced honours and postgraduate units. Her current research examines various macroeconomics issues, such as the impact of monetary policy on the labour market, the macroeconomics consequences of superannuation, structural change and intergenerational mobility, and developed precise methods to estimate income risk and its impact on consumption. She has presented her research in numerous seminars and at international and domestic conferences. Aarti received a PhD in economics from Washington University and has been a visiting scholar at various international universities and policy institutions, including the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, Cornell University, Oxford University, and Keio University. Everyone, please welcome Associate Professor Aarti Singh.
Thanks, Meg, for a generous introduction. And hello to all the students from Farrier Memorial High School, students from other schools, teachers and educators, and I'm very happy to be here virtually giving this talk. It would have been good to be giving this talk in person, but such is the impact of COVID that goes beyond the fiscal response. So in the topic of today's 30-minute talk is the fiscal response to COVID and what are the implications of that fiscal response. And in the next 30 minutes, what I plan to do is give you an overview of some of the things that I think are important when you're thinking about fiscal policy and the spending that has been, that took place because of the pandemic. And if you have any questions as I'm going through some of the things that I talk about, please feel free to put them in chat, and I'm happy to answer them while I'm giving the talk, just to keep it going so that if you have any clarification questions, we can take care of them. So the main themes that so in this overview that I do in 30 minutes, there are some main themes. So, and what are they? I'll talk about COVID-19, a public health crisis, which had a global impact. Then the economic consequences of the pandemic were extraordinary. And the Australian government and governments in most of the countries in the world initiated new programs. And they extended existing programs to provide income support, like income insurance, to households and businesses. And such large-scale spending, which I think was necessary, increased budget deficits, and to finance that deficit, the government issued new debt. So I'll discuss what are the benefits and what are the costs to the economy. And as you would expect, the debt to GDP levels increased worldwide and also here in Australia. And the question that you might be wanting to think about is the current debt level sustainable, okay, here for Australia or for other countries? And so I'll discuss some issues there. And then I teach a course here in fiscal policy at a third-year course. I think fiscal policy, its role is going to continue to grow as we go into the future. There are lots of uncertainties. So in the fiscal policy scope, we want to think of those uncertainties carefully as the scope of fiscal policy continues to grow into the future. So these are the main themes that I will cover in the next remaining minutes of this presentation. So introduction, well, COVID-19 does not need any introduction. You've heard about it and experienced it yourself. And in recent times, I say recent times because there have been public health crises before, but we didn't live in such a global world. So the impact was, you can easily contain the impact of the virus, but it's no longer the case. So it was a public health crisis like no other that spread globally. So what you have here, I'm going to use in this talk a lot of pictures because sometimes pictures convey the idea much more clearly and cleverly, okay, without too many words. So what you have here is a map from Johns Hopkins, and it shows that globally, the number of deaths that were there due to the pandemic. And the circle, the bigger circle denotes that there were about 1 million deaths, which is here in the US. And the smaller the dot, the fewer were the casualties. And so in Brazil and India, there were about 500,000 people who died because of the pandemic. And in Australia, the dot is smaller. The impact in terms of deaths was much lower. It's about 10,000 people, still a lot, that died because of the pandemic. So given that it was such a global global disease and highly contagious and fatal, it required governments in different countries to take various measures to contain the spread of the virus. And you know of these measures, there was social distancing, there were lockdowns, border closures, and as things improved, countries all over the world had large-scale vaccination programs, so it reduces the intensity of the virus. It has the symptoms are less, etc. So reduces the pressure on the healthcare system. So as you can see, you have these, these measures that were taken by the governments to contain the spread of the virus. These measures then are going to have an economic consequence. So the economic consequence of this public health crisis and the measures, especially social distancing, lockdowns, border closures, which were taken in order to contain the spread of the virus to reduce the pressure on the healthcare system, were extraordinary. And how do I say, or how do I convince you that they were extraordinary? I will show you two pictures which are on the economic, which clearly show you the economic impact on the Australian economy at the aggregate level. So I teach macroeconomics. So here I have a picture of GDP growth on the left-hand side and employment and hours worked on the right-hand side. So as you can see, and these are called time series plot, where on the horizontal axis you have time, and on the vertical axis for GDP growth, it's the GDP growth expressed in percent, okay? So as you know that for the last 30 years, Australia didn't have a recession. And how do I define a recession? It is 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. But the pandemic led the country into a recession. And so the GDP fell about 7% in September 2020, okay? And so there was a big drop in GDP. And as a result, if output is falling in a country, of course, you're producing less, there's going to be less labor employed. And as you can see on the right-hand side, the purple line is your employment, and the orange line is total hours. So you can see that during the pandemic, output fell and employment fell, okay? But one thing I want you to notice is that as soon as things improved and we were able to vaccinate people, contain the virus, things picked up very quickly. So you can see this rebound in GDP growth rate. You can see that employment is going back to its trend. Total hours worked, which is number of people multiplied by the number of hours they work, that has gone up as well. Okay, so I want you to keep this in mind when we go forward. Okay, when I go forward into the discussion. So if you have a public health crisis, which was the case we're discussing today, there was a fiscal response, and the government in Australia took some measures, okay? And the most important one in terms of the fiscal response to the COVID-19 was the JobKeeper program. So JobKeeper program, I have highlighted here, it was a targeted program. So people or businesses who are impacted the most, that's where the program was targeted, or those are the people who are going to benefit. It was a temporary program as well, so it's not going to last forever. It's going to be rolled out. And it was a wage replacement program. And this was something new. This was something that was never done before in any recession. So it was a new idea. It was implemented in various countries. It was implemented differently in different countries, but the idea was the same, okay? What was the idea? The idea was to keep the job and matches intact. Because what happens in a typical recession, you have output falls, some people lose their job, they find a job later on, etc. Here, what happened was the economy was healthy. Suddenly there is a crisis. The government tells you can't go to work. And as a result, you're not able to go to work. So, but it's a healthy match. It's a productive and a healthy match between the worker and the firm. And you don't want to lose that, okay? So what the governments in Australia, or the government here in Australia and other developed countries did was try to keep this match whole, okay? Not let the match be destroyed. So what they did was eligible businesses received payments. They received payments to cover the cost of wages. It was a remarkable program because what it did is it kept these matches intact. It gave households and firms some certainty, reduced the uncertainty. People knew that once we can contain the spread of the virus and things become normal, I have a job to go back to, okay? And that has an impact on how households spend and what they do with their savings behavior. If I know that I have a job to go back to after this public health crisis goes down, it will. I'm not going to save for precautionary reasons. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just, knowing that I have a job to go back to, I will just spend as normal, okay? And then there was this job seeker program. It's the same unemployment insurance program with a new name. They extended eligibility and people received temporary coronavirus supplement. So what you are seeing here is that both the programs are reducing uncertainty, providing households with assurance that they're going to have a job, giving them wages, even though they're not able to work because of the public health restrictions in place. So these were very effective in trying to get people to spend when things became normal. Okay, and that is what I want you to keep in mind. So when I showed you those pictures, you had the GDP fell. It was a public health crisis. People couldn't go to work, so output fell, employment fell. But as soon as we got vaccinations rolling and things were under control here in Australia, there was border closure, so which helped control some of the spread of the virus. And then when things eased, there was a quick rebound. And that was the clever aspect of this fiscal policy, how it was enacted very quickly and effectively, such that the country or the GDP rebounded very quickly, and it had positive aggregate effects. Okay, so this is the positive effect or the benefit of the fiscal response here in Australia. Okay, but apart from this, two new things that were done, in any downturn, there's always an automatic stabilizer. What is that? When you have a recession, some people lose their jobs. As a result, the government loses revenue collected from taxes, but it has to pay higher benefits. Okay, so usually the governments run a deficit because these automatic stabilizers kick in when there is a downturn. And this is what happened even during the pandemic. So if you had a deficit, it slightly worsened during the pandemic. Okay, so these automatic stabilizers are built into the policy making, which kick in as soon as things go bad. And so I think overall the measures that were taken here in Australia were appropriate. They were much needed. We couldn't have done without it. You can see the benefits. You can already see the benefits. Even if I don't show you the aggregate GDP numbers, you can see that things rebounded very quickly. And it's because of these programs, especially the ones that kept the job matches intact. Okay, and so people had a job to go back to and increase their consumption spending as long as they could. So as a result of the COVID-19 government, again, I try to sometimes, when in a talk like this, show you lots of pictures that give you a feel of what's going on. Okay, so this is a picture from the IMF, which shows that it's not just here in Australia, but globally, government spending as a fraction of GDP increased. So what you have here is a map of the world, and the dark green areas show that more than 10%, the spending increased by more than 10% of GDP. And that's here in Australia, here in Canada, United States, some countries in Europe. So Australia is not alone when it came to spending during the COVID. Other countries also spent a lot as a fraction of their GDP. And as you would expect, poorer countries, they have less resources, the governments, they have less resources available. So they spent less. And you can see that in some countries, less than 2.5% of the GDP was the expenditure on COVID-related expenses. And so there is a whole scale which tells you that it was a crisis that required government intervention. Countries all over the world experienced this crisis. Governments spent money in order to keep the economy afloat, okay? So consequently, it's not a surprise that it's going to have an impact on the budget of the government. And so here I have a picture of the Australian government budget balance as a percentage of nominal GDP. On the horizontal axis, I have time. And then on the vertical axis, it tells you the deficit or a surplus as a percent of nominal GDP. So here you have the zero line. Anything below the zero indicates that you have a deficit. And anything above zero indicates that you have a surplus. So there were some periods where you had a surplus in the 1990s, but you can see there was a big recession in the 1990s where you had a deficit. Then there was some surplus. Then the GFC, again, the government had sent checks. There was a deficit. And they were projecting surplus, but of course, then COVID happened. And the extraordinary spending that the government had to do, it led to bigger deficits, okay? And the projection, so this is the projection into the future, is that these deficits are going to go down, okay? And you might end up into a surplus or not. But what I want to highlight is that that's probably not the most important picture that you want to focus on, which is deficit, okay? Which is every year The government talks about it, but what I want to highlight is that there are bigger things that you might want to focus on. Now, how do you, when you're thinking about, say, government spending, the question that comes up is, how do you finance government spending or fiscal spending? Okay, so here's a picture. You have two main sources of funding during normal times when things are not in a crisis mode. So one is you get funding from, you get your revenue from taxes. So you have income taxes, you have business taxes, you collect those taxes, and that's the revenue that you have. And and you can also issue debt. What does that mean? That you can borrow. You can borrow from people, you can borrow from other countries as well. Okay, so these are the two main sources that the government has when it's financing its expenditure: taxes and debt. Okay, now what I want to argue here is that when you have a downturn, the kind of pandemic-related economic downturn that you faced here in Australia and other countries, it's not a good idea to raise taxes or lower spending just to bring your deficit down, lower your debt, etc. Okay, it's a bad idea. So why is that? Because if I raise taxes when you're in a recession or there's a downturn or an economic slump, if I raise taxes, businesses and firms have, as a household, I have less disposable income. If I have less disposable income, my demand is going to go down. So it's a bad idea to do it when you already are suffering from less demand, okay? Similarly, you don't want to raise taxes on firms because then they're going to have a less of an incentive to invest, okay? So raising taxes is not a good idea when you have a crisis. And because consumption spending is a big component of total spending in any economy. In Australia, it's between 50 to 60% of total spending is consumption spending. And if you raise taxes, it will lower spending. Then the other thing is you can say, okay, if the government is worried and it has, it's running a deficit, its expenditure is more than its revenue, what it can do is just reduce the spending, right? I want to reduce my spending. But that again is a very bad idea. When you have a downturn, the government shouldn't go out and say, I'm going to reduce the spending, because that's a big component of GDP as well, because it's around 20 to 25% of total spending. Think about a scenario where people are uncertain, some people are losing their jobs, there is a public health crisis, and if the government starts reducing their spending in order to bring their deficit down, that is not going to go well, and it's going to lower output further, okay? Lower output further, there are going to be fewer jobs, and so on and so forth, okay? So what I want to highlight here is that issuing debt is therefore it was the right thing for the Australian government to do when there is an economic crisis, which has resulted in an economic downturn. So you are here in the pandemic, it's a public health crisis, it had an impact globally. The government had to move in, spend a lot, and it shouldn't then quickly revert and start increasing taxes or lowering spending. It's not going to go well. Okay, so debt was the only option that was left for the government to work with. So let's look at, it's a nice picture from the Treasury, which is looking at the debt to GDP ratio. And this gives us a good perspective of what's happening around us, okay? So this is for debt to GDP ratio in different countries: Japan, Italy, United States, France, Canada, United Kingdom, Germany. Here is Australia, here's New Zealand. On the left vertical axis, it's government debt as a percentage of GDP. And on the right vertical axis it's the increase in debt in percentage points as a fraction of GDP because of the pandemic. So the first takeaway from here is that Australia, debt to GDP ratio is low. It entered the pandemic with a very low debt to GDP ratio. It was below 50%. That's the first takeaway. Compared to United States that entered the pandemic with close to 150% debt to GDP ratio, okay? And Japan, for different reasons, demographic trends, slumps since the 1990s, it's had a very high debt to GDP ratio, close to 220% of GDP. So the first takeaway is Australia's debt was much lower. It was lucky in some way that it entered the pandemic with low levels of debt. Okay? And then because of spending, which we talked about, its debt is it's financed this spending by issuing debt, by borrowing. And as a result of that, what you see here is this dark blue line, which shows that the debt to GDP has increased. And what is the increase actually? It's about 20 percentage point, okay? So it went from say 45 to 65, say for example. So the increase, overall increase is 20 percentage point. Now, again, this increase is similar to what happened to UK. It's similar to New Zealand. It's a bit higher than Germany. So the increase in debt because of the pandemic-related expenses, it's higher than Germany, but it is lower than Japan, Italy, United States, France, and Canada. So it did well in terms of getting in to the pandemic with low levels of debt, increasing spending by issuing debt. That was the right thing to do. Its debt level increased, but it's still not as high as some other countries. So that's what I want you to take away from there. This is that, yes, there's a cost. There's a cost to the society in terms of higher debt levels. You have to service this debt in the future. But the benefits that we led to a rebound in the economy very quickly much outweigh the costs. That's what I'm going to argue next. So this takes me to an important question that is often discussed in the academic literature, in macroeconomics, and you'll find many papers in the IMF that talk about fiscal sustainability. And it talks about whether the debt that the country has accumulated, whether it's sustainable or not. Okay, so that's what I will discuss now. So I'll give you a small example just to help you relate to all of this, okay? My husband and I, we both work, we have 2 children. Suppose I have a bad health shock, okay? We use our savings to pay for some of the health shock. Health shock is bigger, and I might not be able to go for work for a couple of months, maybe. So we put some of that medical expense on our credit card, right? And so we've incurred a debt, incurred credit card debt. Now, when you take up that debt, there are 2 important considerations. Is whether my income as the household, income is increasing in the future, and the interest payments on credit card debt. Why is that? Because I will need that future income in order to pay for that debt. And the debt servicing cost, the interest rate, is important because that's what, till I pay the whole principal, I'll be servicing my debt, right? Similarly for the country, any country or any government, there are 2 important considerations when you're thinking about debt sustainability. It depends upon the future revenue. So think about the tax base. The tax base could increase because of population growth rate, etc. But it also increases when the country or when the economy is growing. The income in the economy is growing. If the income grows, the whole tax is fixed, we'll be collecting more revenue. So the future revenue flow depends upon the growth rate of GDP, which is G here. And here I'm denoting everything in real terms. You can do this analysis in nominal terms as well, okay? and it will be equal. Now, what about the interest payments on public debt? Why is that important? Because I have some debt. It's the cost of servicing that debt, and that's R. Okay? So it's a real interest rate. So think about these two important things. One is making your tax revenue increase, and the other one is the cost of servicing your debt, the government debt. Okay. Debt is higher than before, but as I showed you in that picture, in Australia, debt to GDP is still much lower than other countries. And we know, you've seen the inflation numbers here in the US, and you know that the RBA is increasing the normal interest rate, the cash rate, and so the real interest rate is likely to increase. But, and you can have potential vicious cycle where you have higher interest payments, leads to higher budget deficit. In order to pay for that deficit, what do? You borrow, so your debt increases, then the interest payments increase further, etc. This vicious cycle can go on. What I will argue here is that for Australia and some of the countries, it's not really a concern. So if the debt servicing cost, which is R, is less than G, okay, where the economy is growing at a faster rate than the cost of servicing this debt to GDP ratio will fall gradually over time without the government having to increase taxes in the future, okay? This is because you have this debt servicing cost that's lower than the growth rate of the economy. And if this R is less than G, debt to GDP is going to fall and vice versa. This does not mean that, if R is less than G, you go and borrow a lot. Okay? This just says that things are sustainable. And vice versa. If R is greater than G, debt to GDP is not going to fall. It's going to rise. But what I want to emphasize here is that in most of the advanced countries, R is less than G. So I was looking at the numbers, R is less than G, okay? I was looking at some of the numbers here in Australia, and the growth rate of GDP is 3.5% to 4%. The real interest rate is 1.64%. And if you were doing things in nominal terms, you'll also again find that R minus G is a negative number, and it's in most of the advanced countries. So this debt, which we've incurred, is going to fall over time. And so here are two pictures from the Parliamentary Budget Office. And there are two scenarios. This is the best case scenario. What is it here that I'm plotting? It's time and debt as government debt as a percentage of GDP. And this is from this picture is from the Parliamentary Budget Office. And what it shows you is this picture is drawn under the selected scenario where the GDP growth rate is high. So G is 5.5%. And the interest rate is low. So it's in a good situation. What you see here is that even without changing any taxes, because the revenue is growing and the interest payments are low, the interest rate is only 4.3%. So R minus G is negative. So R is less than G. What you see here is, there's some distribution around it, but this red line is showing you that without even having to change any taxes, over time, the debt level of debt as a fraction of GDP will decline. And in this best case scenario, the PBO estimate says that the gross debt will be around 20% of GDP by 2060 without having to change any taxes. Okay, so this is the best case scenario where you have that R is less than G. Yeah. So in the other scenario where you start with high debt, and like before, you start with high debt. Here you have the same thing. But what is different here is that G, so this is the worst case scenario, And what you have here is that the growth rate is 4.3% and the interest rate is 5.5%. So what does that mean is that the interest payments R is greater than G. And as a result, the debt level is not going to come down as quickly as it did in the earlier scenario. And the PBO estimate says that the gross debt will be around 40% of GDP, okay? So this is telling you that, that's still very low compared to what's happening in other countries. So I wouldn't worry about it. But what it says is that Australia did well. It came into the pandemic with low levels of debt. R is less than G in Australia and in most of the advanced countries. The cost of servicing the debt is going to be low. And so this is, say, the cost for the economy, but the benefit, which was the quick rebound in GDP, and as a result, G will go up. Okay, they're all connected. And that will, they outweigh, so these benefits outweigh the cost that we will face. Okay. So looking ahead, I have a few minutes left, and I just want to highlight a few things before I end this talk. So overall, we've seen the pandemic had a global impact. The response of the government was extraordinary. It led to higher debt, but as long as R is less than G, we'll be able to service this debt. And there are some projections which make Australia look like as if it's in a good situation. But what I want to highlight here is that, whenever students think of fiscal policy, they think of this narrow, sometimes narrow definition where you're thinking about the budget, the deficit, etc. So it's a much more yearly focus, just thinking about the deficit. But I want you to think about fiscal policy actually playing a much bigger role in the economy. So it has this short-term role, which comes through automatic stabilization. We've seen that in GFC and in this pandemic, the government acted very effectively and efficiently in responding to a crisis and coming up with a fiscal response which was appropriate and much needed. So it does play an important stabilization role. There's a lot of research which shows now that the fiscal multiplier is greater than 1 in a recession. And what does that mean is that if the government spends $1, GDP in the economy increases by more than $1. Okay, so it's effective in this stabilization policy where we've always thought of monetary policy in recent times helping the economy come out of recession. But I would argue that fiscal policy is going to play an important role going forward. And this is the short run. In the medium run and in the long run, if you're looking at the budget, pay careful attention to what are the policies that are being undertaken to increase that G, because that G has an impact on your income, the aggregate growth of the economy. It has an impact on debt sustainability, everything. So those are important things. Like, is it investing in the country that will make it more productive, increase education, etc. Those are important things which the fiscal policy has a lot of control. Apart from distributional issues where taxes provide reduce inequality in the country. So there are very interesting roles of the fiscal policy, and I see these roles expanding as we go into the future. And finally, I want to end this talk by mentioning that this is, I've talked only about fiscal policy, but there is a coordination which is required between fiscal and monetary policy. It's not that both of them have to sit together, but they both have to be cognizant of what the other person is doing in order to make a policy that is good for the Australian economy. For example, you see the inflation increasing. The objective of the RBA is to bring inflation down between its target of 2 to 3%. It's going to raise the interest rates. That's going to have an impact, as we just saw, on the real interest rate as well. And so there is some synergy between the two. And one needs to think about that much more carefully, and policy discussion about coordination between the two policies should, I feel, should now be happening. Okay, so with that, I want to end my this 30-minute talk. And I thank all of you for coming in here and listening to this. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Associate Professor Singh. Very interesting and very, I guess, topical with as we just went past. We live in a post-pandemic world. If anyone has any question, please use the Q&A tool at the bottom of the Zoom window, and we have a few minutes to answer your questions. If any of the teachers are broadcasting in your class, please encourage your students to ask questions. Oh, thank you so much. We have a question from Jamie. Are there any policies in the most recent budget that you believe will be the most beneficial moving forward?
So, hi, Jamie. I think the policies that will be effective are anything that increases the productive capacity of the economy. So encouraging workers to enter the labor force. So making it easier for women to participate in the labor market. So I think those are the policies that will increase the labor force, people who work, increase the tax revenue for the government, and anything that increases productive capacity, which I haven't seen in the last budget, that would be much more effective. Yes, there were some things that were done in order to reduce the cost of petrol. Those are short-term things, which I think can be distracting from the long-term goals where the government can play a very important role, where it increases productivity, encourages people to get into the labor market, facilitates women entering the labor market. Those are the things that I think are important.
Thank you. Any other questions? We still have a few other minutes, and it's a great opportunity to get Associate Professor Singh to answer your question directly. No. While waiting for more questions, I guess I wonder if any of the recent government movements, things like housing policy or purchasing the properties and things, how it's going to change the Australian economy from now on. Aarti, if you would like to give any comments on that.
Well, that's a very big question. I think that requires another talk where I have to research a little bit more. I know that they are trying to remove the stamp duty, and there was a lot of discussion where stamp duty was considered not good. And I think there's a lot of discussion about negative gearing as well, which is important. Where people think that negative gearing probably has distorted the housing market. So that's an important consideration to keep in mind. Now, the RBA raising, so there's a lot of discussion in the media about RBA raising interest rates when, when people have borrowed. But I will stand with the RBA where I say that, the objective of the RBA is to have inflation between 2 to 3%. It has only, so you think about a bow and an arrow. You have one arrow, one target. That's what you can do. You have cash rate. You can use that to hit that target of inflation. And inflation is outside the bounds. You need to respond by raising the cash rate. Now, there are questions asked about forward guidance, and the RBA had promised that it's going to keep it for longer. It was time dependent versus state dependent. Those are different considerations, but yes, it's going to have an impact on the housing market. I'm no forecaster and I don't know. But yes, government policies do have an impact. Whether we want to think about, is it of first order importance or not, that's an, only research can show us as to what will be the implications.
Thank you. Thank you.
There are some other questions there.
Yes, we have a question from Stephen. Do you think the effectiveness of fiscal policy will be limited by the current increases in the cash rate?
Sorry, what was the question?
Oh.
There's one more question. There's
yeah.
By Terry Frank. Are there any? I can answer both questions. So let's go.
Okay, sure.
Yes.
We'll go with Terry's one first. Sorry, Stephen. I'll go with Terry's one. Are there any labour market policies that you would suggest the government use to improve productive capacity that they are currently not using?
So I think the big question that the new government, so it changes from government to government. That's why fiscal policy is probably harder, because it depends on who's there in the government. But I think the biggest challenge for Australia is the climate change. And for me, that's the biggest issue. And how we move towards that, our goal of reducing emissions, in a way that keeps jobs safe and retrains train workers who are working in industries that are polluters is going to be important. But in terms of labor market policies, I think always that comes up is female labor force participation, how to encourage more. And the government does a lot in terms of providing childcare support, and whether that's effective or do we need to do more? That could be one thing. The other thing would be, is our education, the education that we are providing in the high school and at the university, is it also appropriate in increasing the productive capacity in the country? So trying to figure out what the country needs, which are the areas that need development, and are we training our current students in the right field? So is it STEM or is it those kinds of programs? That's where we should be funded. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. And I guess this will be the last question from Stephen. Do you think the effectiveness of fiscal policy will be limited by the current increases in the cash rate?
So that's a question. That was my last point. It impinges. I do not think that the RBA can worry about the debt of the central bank, of the Treasury. But what the Treasury can do is to ensure that it locks in a low interest rate. So instead of having 10-year debt, have a long-term 30-year debt. So you fix your interest rate, might be higher, but you fixed it for a longer period of time. And that will be effective in reducing this burden of debt in the future. So I think that would be an important thing for the fiscal authority to take care of. But the RBA, yes, it has to do what it has to do, but the Treasury should be forward-looking and say, okay, let's lock in this interest rate for a longer period of time. That's my answer.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I think we have just passed the time now. Just before everyone leaves, I just want to share my screen.
So I should stop sharing?
Yes, please. Thank you very much. I just wanted to share, thank you so much, Associate Professor Aarti, for a wonderful presentation. And I hope it was valuable information for everyone in this webinar for HSC preparation. And if you enjoyed today's webinar, we do have a few more articulate webinars coming up in term 3. We have Chinese in Context on 26th of July on the Shansha genre of fantasy TV and drama. Save the date for open day on Saturday, the 27th of August. I believe it's going to be an in-person on campus here at the university. So it's a great opportunity for you to come and see some mini lectures, go on the campus tours and so on. On 14th of September, we have French continuous and extension webinar. And finally, in Camp 4, on the 19th of October, we have Articulate Social Media. So if you are interested in these topics, please do join us, and I hope to see you all there. Finally, thank you once again for Aarti for joining us today and taking your time to put this presentation together. Would you like to say something before we go?
Yes, so thank you to everyone, and good luck to all the students who were there online as you work towards your Year 12 and your HSC exam. And if you have any further questions, please feel free to email me. I think the email must be somewhere there. It's aarti.singh@sydney.edu.au. So you can feel free to follow up with any questions that you might have regarding whatever I've talked about, or just any question. Okay.
Great.
And I look forward to seeing you at University of Sydney at some point.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much. Bye-bye.
Yes. Bye.